anyone watching the nightly news could be forgiven for thinking that the world is getting more and more violent every day. But neuropsychologist Steven Pinker, who's taught at Harvard, MIT, and Stanford, in addition to being named one of Time magazine's 100 most influential people in the world, doesn't believe it.
Believe it or not, we may be living in the most peaceable time in human history. Now, it's hard to believe because there's always enough violence to fill page one of the newspapers. But if you actually count bodies, how many people die violently as a proportion of the population, we're actually much, much better off on every scale.
Tell us about the different eras. I mean, I think we all think about, perhaps the early man being very violent, the Middle Ages being very violent.
Well, the Middle Ages were far more violent than the life we live today. One good thing about murders is that you can count them because they're dead bodies. And historians have gone back to town records in Europe, back to the Middle Ages, and they found that the murder rate in England and Germany and France was about 50 times higher in the 13th and 14th century than it is today.
So do you think that we're becoming more peaceable as we evolve, or is there something about the way the media covers violence now that's just sort of making us satiated with violence?
Well, it's certainly more vivid. It's we see pictures, we see video footage, we have victims interviewed, so a human face is put on the violence. But I don't think we've evolved biologically. I don't think that genetically we're any different from the people in the Middle Ages. But we've changed our social arrangements to make violence more consistently punished. We've changed our cultural and social norms so that violence is less and less acceptable.
Do you feel that people are essentially good or essentially evil?
Well, I think we harbor both. I think we have capacities for greed, for revenge, but we also have the capacity for self-control, for empathy and compassion, for developing social norms that just make violence taboo. And human history, I think, is a battle between which of those impulses wins out.
And which systems do you think, as you look at history now and see this movement toward nonviolence, what kind of systems or social movements have been pushing us toward peace?
I think democratic government is certainly a force towards nonviolence. If you can't dial 911 and call the police, you've got to defend your interests with violence or the threat of violence. If you've got a police and courts and legal system, then that tamps down all of the culture of vendetta.
Do you think that genocide is a uniquely modern problem? I think we look back at the last century and see the Holocaust, we look at Cambodia, we look at Rwanda.
It's absolutely not new. There are records of genocide as far back as you go. I'll tell you what's new. What's new is actually caring about the victims of genocide. The word genocide didn't exist until the 1940s. No one really cared. It was no big deal. It was, you read histories, you read about so-and-so the great, empires rise, empires fall. I think what's new is that genocide is a bad thing. And so, fortunately, we're more aware of them. We even have the idea of stopping genocides in countries that aren't particularly important to us. Radically new idea.
So that's a very interesting point, that we now feel a moral obligation, sometimes, not always.
We don't always act on it.
To reach out and try to stop internal strife that's resulting in genocide in other countries. Where do you see us moving as a civilization in this regard?
Well, it's a profound question. It really you put your finger on the problem. Namely, on the one hand, we think that sovereignty is a really good idea, that those borders on the map, if they're cast in stone, then you don't constantly have countries trying to rationalize the borders by invading their neighbors, and so the number of wars go down. On the other hand, the idea that what goes on in some dinky country over there is none of our business. Some dictator can murder its citizens, and since it's his country, not ours, we can't butt in. That goes against another important principle, namely that human life is more important than national sovereignty. I don't think we've figured out how to balance those two ideals.
What kind of conclusions do you expect to draw?
That the world has been getting more peaceable, that old-fashioned notions like civilization and enlightenment, which started to seem a little corny, I think actually have some truth to them. That modernity is a good thing. We often think, well, we've got our we're warm, we can get on planes, we've got our iPhones. That's the good side of technology and science and modernity. But the bad side is we have a lot more wars and violence. Not true. We have far fewer wars and less violence. So it comes out in favor of modernity, civilization, and enlightenment.